income inequality, I think Indian statistical system, particularly the national income accounting system, is one of the robust in the world. In fact, it's better than many of the developed countries as well. But there is a limitation. We don't have the distributional data of income at the household level. We have the income data at the national level, no problem, at the state level, at the sectoral level, but at the individual household level, we collect information on consumption, expenditure. But nonetheless, there are reports coming for global comparisons, making some adjustments with the data. The most common thing is the Credit Suisse data, which is available globally. And that comparison does show that India is one among the very high unequal countries in the world as far as the income and also the wealth data are concerned. I was looking at the latest publications at the global and also at the national level. You do find that the top 10% of the wealthiest in India has more than 70%, 72, 73% of the total wealth, which is really very, very alarming. But on the contrary, if you look at the world data, you find the situation is more or less similar. About 75, 78% of the total wealth is concentrated in 10% of the household's hands. So, for a country which is at a very low level of economic development, well, now we hopefully will graduate to the higher income category in a couple of years. But, at the moment, this high level of inequality in wealth as well as income is a matter of serious policy concern because it affects the poverty level. Poverty is absolute deprivation. So if there is high inequality at a higher level of income and wealth, it doesn't really affect the basic survival. But certainly in the context of India, 72% of the, and in fact, 1% having more than 40, 50% of the total wealth is certainly a matter of serious concern. And we do need to address this issue before we can really talk about sustained economic development for the next 2-3 decades.
So while the government said in parliament that the data on class distribution of income is not available, and as you also just said that we have household consumption expenditure data, but this household consumption expenditure data, would it be right to use it as a proxy for class distribution data?
Yeah, in fact, you are right that generally in the context of inequality, if you are going beyond sectoral inequality, because as I said, that income data is available for the different sectors, agriculture, non-agriculture, you have 2-digit level classification, you have transport, banking. For different sectors, we have the income share, and we can find out the inequality in per worker income. We can do that. State level also we can do that, and that has been done. But at the household level, the consumption expenditure data is available now from periodic labor force survey, which is roughly comparable with the earlier national sample surveys consumption expenditure data. And I must tell you that the inequality in the wealth in the last 2-3 years, including the period of the COVID, doesn't seem to have gone up significantly. It has not affected the inequality. There are structural problems in the country which results in very high inequality in income and wealth. But nonetheless, pandemic really brought these problems into public domain. But the structural problems were there even earlier. So I would really think that the pandemic made us aware of the structural inequalities and some of the serious problems therein. But nonetheless, I think the serious increase that we have seen in wealth and income inequality over the past 15 years, which has been reported by different sources, including the Credit Suisse data, is certainly a matter of serious concern for a country like India. If we are talking about a sustained growth rate for the 2 to 3 decades, inclusive growth rate, certainly that it will be the most critical issue to be addressed by the government if we are going ahead with the strategy of having a high rate of economic growth, having $10 trillion economy within another 5 to 7 years. Certainly, we must address the problem of unequal distribution of income and wealth across the households.
So you just said that there is a structural problem. What do you mean by that?
You see, I have a feeling that the first issue in the context of the Indian growth strategy is that our linkage with the global market is not extremely high, but it is on the higher side, and it is increasing over time. And as a result, we seem to be importing some of the uncertainties from the global market. In the present budget, you heard our Honorable Finance Minister mentioning that our Indian economic growth rate, despite the revision downwards, would be something between 5 to 6%, which is reasonably high compared to the global growth rate. But the finance minister also warned that the next year, the global economic growth rate might be as low as 2%. And that is going to affect our growth rate for the next year significantly. So I have a feeling that we are failure to really develop the local consumption demand. Of course, there is an emergence of middle class, but that middle class demand is also getting linked to the global market. So unless we have a spatially balanced development strategy, our urban structure is extremely unequal. The elite class is concentrated in few metropolitan cities and class one cities. Small and medium towns have not been really connected to the global market adequately. And the small and the villages and the large, settlements have very weak linkages. I would think that a more spatially balanced development strategy wherein the dependence on the local demand, the demand in the rural areas, small and medium towns gets reflected in the global, national market and the global market would be very important. I welcome in this context the strategy of inclusive development, made in India, and also, trying to promote small and medium scale industries, but certainly a much more spatially developed inclusive strategy, particularly addressing the target 11 of SDG, Sustainable Development Goal, is balanced rural-urban linkages, would be extremely important in correcting some of the, structural problems in the country.
So you talk of strategy. Strategies are in line with policies, right? And policies are made basis data. But as there is no class-wise income distribution data that we have. So without the data, how would we form the policies? And also, what is stopping the government to compile that data in this format?
You are right that the decade 2011 to 2021 has been disastrous in the health areas. Our life expectancy overall has been affected badly by the pandemic. In fact, if our global ranking in Human Development Index has gone down, it's basically because our health indicator has suffered. Having said that, the data as far as the income and as far as educational statistics are concerned, I must tell you that this has also been affected by the pandemic. The disaster has been not only for the economy and the health sector, but also for the data system. And yet, I must compliment the Indian researchers. They have been able to somehow build up or estimate or project the figures for 2020-21, even without population census being carried out, national sample survey, also some of the consumption, expenditure, and labor surveys not being done exactly in the earlier manner. But the periodic labor force survey, with which I was associated when I was a member of the National Statistical Commission, has provided fairly comparable estimates. And we can say you are right that household level data is not available from the national income sources in any case, but we have consumption expenditure data for 2019, 20, 21, even for 2022, for different socio-religious groups. We have consumption expenditure, even earning data for scheduled caste, scheduled tribe population compared to the non-scheduled caste population. We have also gender-wise, data on earnings. We have also data for Muslims and non-Muslims. And I have been associated with a study done by Oxfam India, not India Inequality Report. I was associated with that also marginally, but subsequently, India Discrimination Report has been brought out by Oxfam India, wherein a comparison has been made of the discrimination. Discrimination is different from inequality. Inequality could be because of the differences in the endowments, your educational qualification, your level at which you are joining. But discrimination is when other things, endowments being similar, and you still have lower access to employment or lower earning because of your social identity, your gender identity, your religious identity, or caste identity. That is discrimination. So this study, based on the limited data brought out, made comparable through a lot of statistical analysis, shows that the caste inequality in the rural areas is pretty high, is as high as 40% of the total gap is explained by discrimination. But this has gone down from about 55% in 2004-5 to something like 40%. As far as the gender inequality is concerned, it is very high. The women are not in the labor market, not having the adequate earning compared to the males, not only because of the employer's mindset, but also the fact that the family does not allow the woman to go out. The caste system doesn't. The societal factors which discriminates against women are all captured in this discrimination model, which shows that women are discriminated to the extent of 70-80%. As far as the Muslims are concerned, we were a bit happy to note that in the rural areas, there is not much of a discrimination against the Muslims in the labor market and access to employment. But in the urban areas, you do find that discrimination against the Muslims is high. It is even higher than that of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe population, which has gone up a little bit over the past 10 to 12 years. So we do have some statistics to make comparison of the changes in the well-being over time on the basis of some statistical analysis that we have to apply on the data available.
You talked of Oxfam report. So as per Oxfam report, that 30% of Indians own over 90% of India's wealth. Similarly, 10% of the topmost Indian owns 72% of wealth, and the richest 5%, nearly 62%. How does this affect a common man?
No, in fact, there are theories that a very low level of inequality, or bringing down the level of inequality to a very low level, might affect growth, might affect saving, might affect investment. But as far all theories and the empirical data, the current level of inequality in India and most of the developing countries is certainly not favoring growth. It is not favoring the macro level parameters that promote growth. In fact, Asian Development Bank has brought out its report called Asia 2030, Asia 2050, in which they are talking about Asia realizing the 21st century. In a way, it is suggesting that 21st century belongs to Asia, belongs to India, provided it can realize its potentials. But one of the problems they have pointed out is the inequality, and particularly inequality in the access to education and skill development. India can certainly maintain its 6 to 7% growth rate in the face of a much lower growth at the global level. But it has to address the problem of unequal access to education and skill development across gender, across scheduled caste, scheduled tribe population, and also across for the religious minorities. Unless you address the problem of access to skill development, you are not going to have this very high growth rate projected in the Indian models and also the general equilibrium model used by Asian Development Bank in projecting the future scenario for Asia, where India emerges as a very strong player.
My last question to you would be, what change do you think should be brought in to narrow the gap of income inequality?
You see, addressing income inequality certainly means some, changes in the paradigm of development and basic thinking. To my mind, the government has given the ideal macro perspective, sabka vikas, sabka saath, sabka vishwas. Basically, they are saying unless you address the problem of inequality right now, you can't say let's have growth now and we will address the problem of inequality at a later stage. That is the message that I gave from the slogan, that the government considers inequality reduction to be the first priority in having a sustained growth rate. But in order to do that, we need to change to extend the sectoral priorities, your emphasis on small and medium industries, the demand which is emerging from the small and medium towns. In fact, a study conducted at Jawaharlal Nehru University shows that only 40% of the total consumer demand is coming for large cities, metropolitan cities. Rest of it can come from the small and medium town, provided you can tap that demand. And that's why I did a study in a way for the Niti Aayog, looking at the urbanization policies and the strategies. We have shown how Indian urban structure is extremely skewed. 72% of Indian urban population live in class 1 cities, and towns living, people living in 20,000 and smaller towns are much less, going down. So we have suggested there has to be change in the strategy of urbanization. Instead of really allowing the large cities, giving smart city mission, Amrut, and trying to strengthen the infrastructure only in the large metropolitan cities, you can identify 2,000 small and medium towns and provide the basic infrastructure. The 2011 census has identified 3,000 new towns which have come up without any governmental support. They are census towns. They are not recognized by the government. So if the towns can come up on their own without much support, if you provide some infrastructural support, I'm quite sure the rural population, rural middle class, and the small town middle class can be linked. And that would really bring the total population into the overall developmental framework. So I do believe that change in the strategy of economic development, favoring the labor-intensive sectors, small and medium, industries, and more spatially developed, spatially balanced strategy of development, including small and medium towns and the rural areas, would be the necessity and the priority for today.
Amitabh, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Vikas.